This is an exciting day because you officially get to use the very special liquid watercolors. These watercolor sets are super special and very amazing because the water is already mixed in. You'll remember in other years you had to take water from your cup and mix it into the watercolor paint tray. It takes a lot longer to use that kind of watercolor set, and the colors aren't always as bright as you would hope that they would be. So to set up, I am just taking the lids off of these watercolors very carefully. You don't ever want to take the watercolor cup out of the white tray. If you get a little bit of paint on your fingers while you're doing that, just kind of make it dry and you can wash your hands at the end. The first thing that I want to show you is the wet on dry technique. So I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to just pick a random color. I'll do orange. I'm going to dip my paintbrush in that orange paint. I can kind of swirl it up if it looks like it's been a while since it's been used. Kind of mix up any of the paint that is settled. And then an important thing with these paints is you want to scrape off the extra paint on the side of the dish so that you don't have a paintbrush full of way more paint than you're ever going to use. Next, I'm going to paint one of my shapes, and notice that I am painting with my tiptoes. I'm using the tiptoe part of my brush, so only that very, very bottom part of the brush is getting paint. Since this is the wet on dry technique, I'm gonna let that paint dry while I do some other stuff, and then I'll come back and show you what's great about the wet on dry technique. The next thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna try out the wet on wet technique. In order to do that, I need to first rinse out my brush, and I'm gonna paint just a clear water over the shape or the part of my artwork that I want to do wet on wet. Wet on wet creates a really interesting technique because it mixes those paints together. It kind of encourages them to mix. So after I've got the water part done, I can dip my brush in a color, scrape off that extra paint, and then I'm gonna put just like little dots of color into the spot where I painted that clear water. If I want to get more than one color going for my wet on wet technique, I can rinse my brush again, scrape off that extra water, because remember this paint already has water in it. You don't want to add a whole bunch of water with your paintbrush. I can dip it into a different color of paint, and then I can add even more color to that part of my artwork. This is a really fun technique. The more that you experiment with it, the more interesting stuff you'll figure out that you can do. The next technique I want to show you is wax resist. And for wax resist, I need to get a waxy art supply, like a crayon or an oil pastel would work too. You can use any kind of crayon. You can use metallic crayons, construction paper crayons, or just regular normal Crayola crayons. You want to press down really hard while you're drawing your designs. You can draw any kind of design that you want. I'm just going to stick with some stripes. And then you want to make sure your brush is clean. Scrape off that extra water. And I'm going to scrape off the extra paint into my mixing tray, or into my paint tray. And then I can just paint right over the crayons. The cool thing about wax resist is that the waxiness of the crayons means that those lines or designs will push through the paint. That's why it's called wax resist. You want to make sure you press down hard with the crayons though, or else it won't work. For the next step, I want to show you how to mix colors. I'm going to start off by rinsing my brush like I usually do, scraping that water into the cup, and then I'm going to get some paint from my paint tray and add it into my mixing tray. You can get a little bit more than just one paintbrush full if you think you might need 2 or 3, depending on how big of a space you're going to paint. I'm only going to paint a small space, so I only need a little bit. Before I get a new color, I always want to rinse my brush off really good, scrape off that extra water, And then I can start adding a different color into my mixing tray. I can add more of that same color without rinsing my brush each time if I make sure that when I add the color, my brush is not touching the color that's already in the mixing tray. That'll save you a little bit of time so you don't have to constantly rinse off your brush. Once I know that I have enough of the green, I can go ahead and use my brush to mix those colors together. I'm hoping for a blue-green, so let's see how it did. Then I'm going to paint. Oh, yep, I got a beautiful blue-green. Mixing colors is one of the best ways to make your artwork have more detail and look more interesting. You can always kind of tell when someone only uses the colors straight out of the paint tray, and it looks a little bit less interesting if the artist didn't take the time to mix new colors to use in their artwork. I'm painting with just the tiptoes of my brush. And then I'm going to go ahead and use this same color for finishing up the wet on dry technique. So remember, wet on wet was when we made the colors mix on purpose. For wet on dry, I want to make sure that the color I already painted is dry. Oop, you can see it wasn't super dry in the end there. So I'm going to go ahead and focus on painting on this side where it is dry. When you do wet on dry, it keeps the colors from mixing. So I'm going to get some paint on my paintbrush, and then using just the tiptoes of my brush, I can paint a color right next to that dry color, and those colors will stay separate. They won't mix like they did with the wet on dry technique. So this is a good technique for if you are painting something where you do not want those colors to mix. Let's say my plan was to paint in the rest of this background, a blue-green color. I would want to make sure and wait until the colors of the shapes had dried before I started painting next to them. So I probably am not ready to paint next to this shape or this shape because those are both still wet.